Samuel T. Wilkinson is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine, where he also serves as Medical Director of the Yale Depression Research Program. Dr. Wilkinson received his BS in Mechanical Engineering, summa cum laude, from Brigham Young University, and later his medical degree from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He completed his residency at Yale, where he joined the faculty following his postgrad training. His primary research has focused on depression and suicide prevention and has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. Wilkinson has published extensively in his field, but also in the popular press. His research and articles have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and countless other publications. He's been the recipient of many awards, including the Top Advancements and Breakthroughs from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, Top 10 Psychiatry Papers by the New England Journal of Medicine, the Early Career Scholar Award from the American Psychiatric Association, and the Samuel Novy Writing Prize in Psychological Medicine from Johns Hopkins. Most recently, he's the author of the groundbreaking new book, Purpose, which challenges the idea that evolution is intrinsically atheistic and antithetical to the concept of God. It's a fascinating read. I've enjoyed reading it. I've recommended it to many people, and I hope you'll pick up a copy of the book. If you didn't during the welcome reception, we also have it at our bookstore here on campus. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wilkinson for his lecture, What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to direct my remarks mainly at the young people today, the students, and I'm defining young as anyone who is my age or younger. So as I was preparing this talk, I mentioned to my family that I was coming up to the University of New England and giving an important lecture, and immediately my 11-year-old son said, "Dad, why are you giving that lecture? You're not very important." And acknowledging that he was right, but being the brave man that I am, I asked if he had any advice. And this is the advice he gave me. He said, "Dad, be brief, don't drone on, be dramatic, but not too dramatic, and most important, skip the boring stuff." So I will endeavor to follow that sage advice from my precocious son. So it's a great treat to be here. I'm grateful to Josh and everyone else who's made this event possible. I am going to be speaking today about an interesting combination of topics from a variety of disciplines. Evolution, human nature, and the meaning of our existence. As Josh mentioned, I lead the Yale Depression Research Program, so I spent a lot of time thinking about how we can better understand depression and also how we can better treat it. But I also have a deep interest in how people can better thrive and be successful. I'm also, I'll just note, a fellow at the Wheatley Institute, which is part of BYU. So when I first started studying evolutionary theory, I must admit I didn't like it. This is Charles Darwin, okay, and the monograph of his most famous work, The Origin of Species, which he published in 1859. And there were two things about, at least what I thought this implied, about the nature of reality that I didn't like. The first thing I didn't like was this notion that life is meaningless, okay? And a lot of this had to do with this sense that life came about through a totally random and haphazard process. And in studying this, many of the great thinkers in evolutionary theory basically explicitly said this, okay? This is a man named Stephen Jay Gould. He was a evolutionary biologist who worked and taught at Harvard for many years. And in response to this question, why are we here? This is what Professor Gould offers. He says, "We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar anatomy that transformed into legs because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species, that's us, has managed to survive by hook and by crook. We yearn for a higher answer, but none exists." Okay, now, so I think, again, this is related to this conception that a lot of people have when they think of evolution as a totally random and haphazard process, and therefore life is a a happy accident. Well, for many people, it's a happy accident. And so therefore, there's no ultimate purpose or meaning. And perhaps, to me at least, more surprising than this worldview that he has was the fact that I found this in a book called Who's Who in Hell by Warren Allen Smith. Some of you who are older may remember the Who's Who series, Who's Who in Medicine in America and whatever. Apparently, I didn't know this version existed. Now, it turns out that Gould wasn't quite right, or his perspective is not the only one. There's a whole relatively new body of evidence from biology that there were many parts of evolution that were not random, and in theory were predictable. I don't have a lot of time to go into this part of this dilemma that I had, so you'll have to read the book for that. But take it for now. Just take my word that there's a lot of evidence that shows how at different starting points, different evolutionary paths came upon the same solution, the same structure, the same types of creatures, and so forth. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this was not a totally random and haphazard process. Now, this doesn't necessarily prove, of course, that life has an intrinsic meaning or purpose, but for me at least, it opens the door a little bit, brings us a little bit closer there. The second part about evolutionary theory that I did not like when I really delve into it was the sense of what it implied about human nature. And ergo that humans are ultimately selfish, okay? I think, again, a lot of lay people, when they think of evolutionary theory and what it implies about human psychology and behavior, is not good, right? One of the reasons I thought this, again, was because many of the leading thinkers in this space explicitly said so. Okay, this is a picture of a relatively well-known book. It was published in the 1970s by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. And in the opening pages of this book, Mr. Dawkins says, "Be warned if you wish to build a good society in which people interact generously and cooperatively with one another, you will get no help from biology because we are born selfish." Now, to me at least, that's a bitter pill to swallow and a depressing view of human nature. And it's certainly easy to think of cases in point from history where humanity has treated each other in terrible ways. But I will submit that this is not the full and complete picture of human nature. Let's go to what evolutionary theory might imply about this. And I think I'm going to use this phrase here, survival of the fittest, which is a key concept in evolution. Now, I'll note that most modern biologies, they'll prefer the phrase natural selection. But I'm going to use this phrase because I think most people intuitively kind of grasp what it gets at. And what I will offer is that in order to understand human nature, really the nature of any creature, you need to turn this phrase into a question. And the question is, survival of the fittest what? What are we talking about? Are we talking about a survival of the fittest individual, or maybe the survival of the fittest family or group? And the answer to this question has profound implications for the behavioral tendencies and psychologies that will emerge. I'll share one such example. And this example stumped Darwin himself when he was formulating his theory of evolution. He thought that this was a potential deal breaker and the one that could render his whole theory unworkable. The example that stumped Darwin initially was that of honeybees. So for those who haven't learned about honeybees in a while, let me tell you a little bit about the social structure of a honeybee hive. As many of you may know, there's a single female queen. There's a couple hundred male drones, and there's about 50 or 60,000 female worker honeybees, all of which are infertile or incapable of reproduction. And this puzzled Darwin because he thought, well, if survival and reproduction is so important, how on earth would nature produce this social order where the vast majority of creatures cannot reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation? Right? That was the mystery to him. Then he realized, I think he was thinking only of the frame on the left. It was a survival of the fittest honeybee. But then he realized, well, the worker honeybees, all of which are incapable of reproduction, their traits can be passed on through their sister and brothers, right? They're all genetically related, of course. And so it's not just a survival of the fittest individual, but in some cases, a survival of the fittest hive, okay? And you also see this in another feature of honeybees. So I don't know how many of you have been stung by a bee. It's not a pleasant experience. So when a bee stings, as many of you may know, if the stinger is inserted into a creature with a skin that has a certain thickness, the stinger is barbed. And so it goes in, but it doesn't come out easily. And this is, in many instances, is certain death for the bee, right? And so again, why would evolution come up with this? This is essentially suicide for the bee. Well, it turns out that honeybees really only sting when they feel like their hive is being attacked. They rarely sting way out in isolation. Not only do they sting when they feel like their hive is being attacked, but they will also emit a signal which will call other honeybees to come and protect the hive and also sting. So that mechanism, again, is not necessarily beneficial to the individual bee, but is beneficial to the group. Okay. Let me share another example, a little closer to home, because it has to do with humans. In the 1860s, there were 2 shipwrecks at the same time and place. This is a depiction of what are called the Auckland Islands, about 300 miles south of mainland New Zealand. Now, 2 ships wrecked here on opposite ends of this archipelago in the 1860s. The first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. Now, fortunately, after a harrowing ordeal of about 18 months, all of the men from his crew survived. The second ship was led by a man named George Delgarno. Unfortunately, most of the men from his ship did not survive. So what was the key difference? Well, the key difference was that the men from Musgrave's group formed an incredibly cooperative and cohesive team. And you saw this within the first minutes, really, of the shipwreck. They wrecked far from somewhat of a distance from the shore, so it wasn't on the shore. They had to swim to the shore, and one of the men was injured. And so Musgrave himself carried this injured man on his back as he swam through the waves to the safety of the shore. Now, I have a 5-year-old, and when he gets on my back in the pool, that's a lot. I can barely keep my head above water. This is a remarkably heroic act that set the whole tenor for the rest of the ordeal. And certainly they had their disagreements and squabbles, but they stuck together. That was the ethos that pervaded their experience. Delgarno's group, they took the opposite approach. They had an every man for himself approach, and you saw this within the first day when they made it to the shore and they left an injured man behind to die on the shore as they searched further inland for food and other resources. Okay, so you can imagine similar scenarios in our distant past where it wasn't selfishness, but it was altruism and cooperation that increased the probability of survival. Okay, so I think there are 2 scientists, 2 biologists that I think sum this up perfectly, this concept that I'm trying to get across, when they note that selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups. And everything else is commentary, right? And I think that's a principle of truth that has to do with our nature and the nature of other creatures. And I will submit as well that it's not just selfishness and altruism, but a whole list of psychological traits and behaviors that we associate with selfishness and altruism, or maybe in more kind of everyday language, good and evil. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do something right now. I want you to think of someone from your life who epitomizes goodness in some way. It could be a relative, a friend, a family member. Now, I want you to think of one word to describe that person. I'll give you maybe 5 or 10 seconds. Am I allowed to call on the audience here? John, any brave volunteer want to say their one adjective that describes this person? We'll go here in the blue. Generous. Great. Okay. He stole your thunder. I'm sorry. Go ahead, ma'am. Compassionate. Okay. Generous. Okay. Lots of generosity. This is a generous group. I can feel it. Great. Selfless. Okay. Yeah. Which is, and I would view as a synonym for altruism. Okay. So this is and I cheated because I've done this more than once. But here are some of the things that I've come up with. Right. So I think they all kind of group together. Right. We all, in our minds, we think of them in the same kind of category. Now let's do the opposite. And I want you to think of a word that describes someone who epitomizes evil. You don't necessarily need to think of, hopefully there are not too many people in your life that this would apply to. But, okay, go ahead. I don't want to get too political here if I can read your mind, but mean, okay, all right. Vindictive, okay, all right. Greedy, okay. So I think right, you're all kind of following along these traditional lines of what we think of as good and evil, right? Here's my, greedy was my first one, so way to go. You get extra points. So when we put on an evolutionary lens, can you see how the features on the left are related to this survival of the fittest family or group, where the features on the right are related to a survival of the fittest individual? So which is it? In our ancient evolutionary history, was it a survival of the fittest individual or more a survival of the fittest family or group? And another way I'm trying to ask this question is, are humans ultimately selfish or altruistic? Any takers? So maybe you see where I'm going with this, is I think it was both. I think it was a mix. There must have been eras where it was a survival of the fittest individual, and there were eras where it was a different level. And I like this framework because I think it makes sense of a lot of contradictory experience and evidence from humanities, from history, about what humanity and human beings are capable of. This is what I call the dual potential of human nature. And this framework, I think, helps us escape the quagmire that philosophers and social scientists have been mired in for centuries. I do think that we have, to some degree, all of us have the capacity for many of these things, right? I think the line between good and evil runs through every human heart to some degree. So what does this have to do with purpose? And for the first half of my talk, when I say purpose and meaning, I'm talking about on a kind of cosmological level. Okay, so this is what this is a bold thing I get. I'm coming here to tell you the purpose of life. When you combine this, the way that nature has shaped our psychologies, our tendencies, behavioral tendencies, you combine that. Now I know there's at least one philosopher in the audience, so we may have to argue later. But when you combine this with the experience, the notion that we have the ability to choose, to me, this provides a very satisfying, from both a spiritual or philosophical perspective and a scientific perspective. I think one of the purposes of life is to choose between these competing dispositions within us. I think life is a test, and it can't be a real test unless we're pulled in one direction or the other. So this, I think from a high level, I really do believe this is one of the purposes why we're here. I can't prove this. I lean on this word imply, which is in the title of my book. Now let's talk a little bit about an individual level, because when people think, oh, I need to get a sense of purpose or meaning, I don't think this helps too much. Let's talk about what it is that people find meaningful and purposeful about life. What is it that leads to personal fulfillment? Now, I am a millennial. I'm one of the older millennials. I was born in the early 1980s. And about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a survey of millennials asking them what is their most important priority in life. As they were, these people are young, 20s, something like that. And about 2/3 of them said that their most important priority is to make money, okay? And another substantial portion, so that you almost got to 80%, another substantial portion said their most important priority was to become famous. I practiced this talk several times with my family, and my teenage daughters kept getting furious that I kept forgetting the name of this person. Apparently, she's some big deal or something. I don't know. Now, it turns out that fame really doesn't have much to do with personal fulfillment and happiness and so forth. Money, you need money to survive and to have enough for your needs. But beyond a certain point, there's a diminishing return. So what is it that from a social science, a psychological science perspective, leads to a meaningful life? Well, there's actually some good evidence about this. And despite the funny turns that my field has taken over the course of history, psychology and psychiatry can contribute a little bit to this important question. I'm going to start with this. This was something called the Harvard Adult Development Study. Those of you who are faculty may have heard of this. In the 1930s, this study was started by the head of the Harvard Health Service, a physician who said, look, we've been spending a lot of time studying what makes people ill. We also need to study what makes people well, what makes them thrive. And so he convinced some rich people to give him some money, and he started evaluating at different points in time a group of Harvard undergraduates, about 250 or so. There were some very famous men in this group, including one future president of the U.S., future senators, a future editor of the Washington Post. In time, they added, because Harvard undergrads are not particularly representative of the whole nation, they added some young boys. Back then, they were only studying men, sorry. But later on, they studied the females in these people's families. They added young people from some of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston. And so they evaluated these people every few years for essentially their entire lives. This is basically the longest running study of adult development. It's called the Harvard Adult Development Study. And over the time, these people have donated lots of their time to the study. In the initial evaluation alone, they spent 8 hours with a psychiatrist. Now, I'm a psychiatrist, and that sounds like way too much time to spend in a single evaluation with a psychiatrist. They had extensive assessments of their physical, psychological profiles. They had measures of respiratory function. They did the SAT. They interpreted ink blots, Rorschach tests. The goal of this study, again, was to figure out what is it that makes a good life. Now, again, this is a long study. There may be one or two, a handful of people who are still alive from this original cohort. So in some ways, it's still going on. One of the directors of this study for about 30 years was a psychiatrist named George Valen. And when he was at the helm of this study, he said, look, we set out to discover what is it that makes a good life, and it's become very clear. The only thing that really matters in life are your relationships to other people. So for better or for worse, your relationships have more bearing on your happiness, your well-being, and to a large part, your health in a very real way. This has been replicated in other studies. This is not a controversial finding in psychological science. One of the questions I'm interested in, which gets discussed a little bit less, is why? Why is this the case? Why are relationships so rewarding? Well, I remember a conversation with a colleague, and we were discussing this, and his answer was, well, maybe that's just how God made us. And I said, look, I don't disagree, but I need a more earthbound explanation. I can't put that in a journal. So if you believe, as I do, that evolution was somehow responsible for our creation and development, then perhaps therein lies part of the answer. I think relationships have always served us so well, right? And our ancient ancestors had to wrestle with a lot of unpredictable risks and dangers. Climate issues were issues back then, perhaps more than today. And those groups that, again, stayed together and worked well together did well. And so relationships were very, very important. Even today, when you could argue that the evolutionary pressures are not nearly as intense as they used to be, loneliness is about as bad for your health as smoking cigarettes or obesity. Okay, so somehow our psychologies have become have been shaped such that relationships are very rewarding. I think that is part of it, but I think another part of why relationships are so important and rewarding has to do with what I consider probably the most biologically relevant relationships, which are the relationships between parents, especially mothers, and their children. Okay. And let me explain to you why this is the case. Some of you, this may be self-evident. In my explanation here, I'm going to talk about the work of another psychiatrist named John Bowlby. Okay. Bowlby was a British psychiatrist born in 1907. Now, he came of age professionally during a time when some of, how shall I say, some of the now outdated theories of Sigmund Freud still held great sway. Among these ideas was the notion that relationships weren't really important. They were just a means to an end. So many of the so-called experts at the time thought, look, relationships, they're just a means to an end. The baby loves the mother because the mother gives the baby milk. The man loves his wife because his wife gives him sex. This is a quid pro quo transactional nature. In fact, there were some experts in mental health who said that too much relationship, too much love was a bad thing. Okay. The president of the American Psychological Association wrote a book in 1928 in which he included this advice to parents on how to treat their children, okay? This is his advice. So you, especially those of you who have kids, let me know what you think about this, okay? His advice to parents: never hug and kiss them. Never let them sit in your lap. If you must, kiss them once in the forehead when they say goodnight. Shake hands with them in the morning. Won't you remember that mother love is a dangerous instrument? An instrument which may inflict a never-healing wound, which may make infancy unhappy, adolescence a nightmare, and wreck your adult son or daughter's chances for marital happiness. Okay, this is a president of the American Psychological Association. By the way, this book that he wrote was called A Godsend to Parents by a little-known magazine called The Atlantic. And there's an anecdote of after this guy spoke at a conference, an elderly woman came up to him and said, "Thank goodness I had my children and I had a chance to enjoy them before I met you." So Bowlby did not buy this, okay? And he thought there's something more here that we're not getting. And he recognized that the quid pro quo did not fully explain the depth of human interaction. So in searching for answers, he studied babies from both humans and animals. Here are a few interesting observations about babies. So baby giraffe. Does anyone know what a baby giraffe does the very first thing when it's born? Any brave? Yeah. Falls 6 feet to the ground. Okay, the female giraffes give birth standing up. Okay, but within an hour, the baby giraffe is standing, walking around, and nursing on its own. Compared to humans, this is very self-sufficient. Those of you who are parents, can you imagine if your baby could walk within an hour of being born? That would be something. A baby blue calf whale can swim to the surface within moments of being born, right? Remember, these are mammals. They need to breathe. They don't have gills, so they need to hop to the surface every once in a while. Humans, on the other hand, we are totally unable to move or eat on our own. We really can't even fully sense our world. In a very real way, we are born half-baked. We are so immature that scholars who study infant development sometimes refer to the first 3 to 6 months of life as the, quote, fourth trimester. Okay. But the slow rate of human development has advantages. It allows human beings to be shaped by our environment more than any other creature. And even though infants don't appear to be particularly social creatures, there are amazing processes unfolding at this time that lay the foundation for essentially all subsequent social interaction. And Bowlby, he figured this out, and he reasoned that basically everything a baby can do, which it can't do necessarily a lot, but it can cry, it can coo, it can suck, it can cling, and when it gets to maybe 2 or 3 months, it can smile, and then later laugh. Everything a baby can do is what he reasoned is to, in part, enhance the relationship with the parents and to keep them close by. This is adaptive from an evolutionary standpoint. Without this, the baby would not survive. But of course, the behaviors of the baby are just one side of the coin. In order for the baby to survive, even thrive, there has to be a strong reciprocal attachment on the part of the parents. Now, fortunately, most of the time, Mother Nature cooperates. And anyone who's had children, most people have had children, can remember the profound love that is experienced upon seeing your first child smile, coo, laugh, etc. The baby represents a huge investment from an evolutionary perspective and necessarily engenders a very, very deep sense of love and affection. I want to share the words of a woman named Dorothy Day, who's a social activist and writer. She writes, "If I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, painted the most beautiful painting, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt after the birth of my first child." Many parents can relate to this. The birth of a first child can induce within a parent a depth of joy and love that was previously not fathomable. Family relationships, from my perspective, family relationships represent the strongest forms of love and affection that nature has created in the flesh. This is the way we've been psychologically engineered, and this is the way we were created. Now, today, there's a bit of a debate, if people have noticed, in popular culture about the importance and value of children in society. To have kids or not to have kids, right? These are what you're looking at. Which path you want to go down? There's a guest column in the New York Times a couple years ago that led with this sentence: "Motherhood is a game, no one wins." Certainly, raising children can be extraordinarily challenging at times. Every parent has their days of quite a bit of frustration. But when researchers ask people, what is it that makes life meaningful, most of them put children and family at top of the list. A study from Pew of about 5,000 Americans reported that parents were twice as likely to describe caring for their children as very meaningful compared to time spent at work. Okay. Another study, the more time parents spend caring for their children, the more meaningful their lives are. Moreover, adults with children generally find life more meaningful than those without children. Now, I want to point out that the demanding nature of being a parent is inextricably linked with the rewarding nature of it, right? We were talking about how we love our children in part because we have to. That's the way that kind of evolution shaped us. But because they are so helpless and dependent upon us for so long, and that age keeps creeping up and up, they are also very challenging. If you have 100 parents in a room and you ask them, what's the most challenging thing you've done? Most of them will say in some form, raise my kids. If you ask them, what's the most rewarding thing you've done? Most of them will say in some form, raise my kids. Okay. Now, let me try to drive this point home with a quasi-serious thought experiment. How would your life be different if you were a seahorse? Okay. Now, seahorses, with seahorses, the males get pregnant. So that would probably lead to some very different parental leave policies, first off. Another interesting thing about seahorses, when the babies are born, there's essentially no parental investment. They're born like about 2,000 babies at a time, and it's, there's no nurturing or rearing. It's kind of like, goodbye, good luck, hope you don't die, pass on my genes. Now, no one, of course, knows exactly what it's like to be a seahorse, no human at least, but it's a good bet that they don't feel a deep sense of love and attachment for their progeny. If nature had created us to be like seahorses, we wouldn't have evolved such love for our children, or probably anyone for that matter. I think this, to me, it reveals a kind of an unexpected twist or truth about the universe at a cosmic or almost spiritual level. At the confluence of biology, evolution, and psychology, there would be no deep love if there were no compelling sacrifice. I think that's true. Let me try to bring this all together. Okay. So, the way I think that nature shaped us leaves us with these competing dispositions. Selfishness, altruism, aggression, cooperation, right? Promiscuity, monogamy. In short, what lay people sometimes call good and evil. I think when you combine this with the ability we have to choose, I think in a real way, life is a test. That's a high-level source of purpose. At an individual level, we find our greatest sense of purpose and meaning in our relationships with other people. In the very end of his book, The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin wrote this: "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one." Now, in a subsequent edition, he inserted 3 very interesting words. Okay, he said, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms into one. Now, whether Darwin inserted those words out of genuine belief or because he felt his largely Christian audience needed to hear it is anyone's guess. He later said he regretted that. But in my view, at least, I think there is grandeur in this view of life. And one of the grand aspects of it is that we are shaped in such a way that we find life's most profound joys in our relationships, especially our family relationships. Thank you for your interest.